By the summer of 1945, the Pacific had become a wasteland of burned coral, shattered steel, and broken men. From the jungles of New Guinea to the cliffs of Okinawa, Japan's once unshakable empire had been reduced to a desperate network of isolated garrisons. The proud imperial army, once sworn to die before capture, now faced an enemy whose industrial power seemed infinite. For years, the code of Bushido had defined every Japanese soldier's duty: to fight without fear, to die without surrender. The very idea of being taken prisoner was unthinkable. Yet, as American forces advanced island by island, reality began to crack that belief. On Saipan in 1944, hundreds of Japanese civilians jumped from cliffs rather than face captivity. On Iwo Jima, nearly 22,000 defenders perished. Only 216 were captured alive. But by Okinawa, the pattern began to change. Thousands of Japanese soldiers and conscripts, starved and broken, laid down their arms. Many did so in disbelief, expecting torture or execution at the hands of the Americans. They had been told Allied troops were monsters, that surrender meant humiliation, mutilation, or death. Instead, they were given water. For many, that simple act was the first crack in a wall of propaganda built over years of war. Allied medics tended to Japanese wounds. Military police issued rations to prisoners. It was a strange kind of victory, not won by firepower, but by humanity. As the months passed, more and more POWs arrived at temporary holding camps across the Pacific: Guam, the Philippines, Hawaii. Later, many were shipped across the ocean to the American mainland, to places like Camp McCoy in Wisconsin or Camp Kennedy in Texas. By war's end, over 50,000 Japanese prisoners were held by the United States. The U.S. military had prepared for the worst. Commanders expected riots, suicides, or organized resistance inside the camps. But what they found instead were men shattered by exhaustion and confusion. The Japanese soldiers had lived under a code that allowed only victory or death. To live as a prisoner was to live without meaning. American officers, however, saw a different mission. The Geneva Convention required humane treatment of prisoners, but beyond legality lay strategy. By treating POWs with dignity, the U.S. hoped to undermine the myths of militarism that had fueled Japan's war machine. Food, medical care, and fair discipline were not just moral acts. They were political ones. Still, the atmosphere remained tense. Language barriers created distance. Fear created silence. Some guards viewed the prisoners with suspicion. Memories of Pearl Harbor and Bataan still raw. The prisoners, in turn, waited for punishment that never came. Each sunrise that passed without brutality deepened their confusion. In many camps, the first attempt at communication came not through words, but gestures. Shared cigarettes. A guard helping a wounded prisoner lift a bucket. A medic showing a patient how to take penicillin. Slowly, the outlines of humanity began to reappear. By autumn 1945, after the surrender of Japan, a strange peace settled over the Pacific. The war that had consumed entire nations ended not with a battle, but with signatures on a battleship deck. The victors turned their attention from destruction to reconstruction, and in those distant camps, the seeds of that transformation were already growing. American officers began introducing small pieces of home into camp life: sports, books, even music. It was not propaganda, but presence. The idea that sound itself, familiar to one side, alien to the other, could bridge what words could not. For the Japanese prisoners, the hum of American life was bewildering. They had been told America was a land of violence and decadence. Yet here, amid the quiet rhythm of camp life, came sounds of laughter, the crack of a baseball bat, and the echo of a trumpet somewhere beyond the wire. It was the beginning of something no one had planned. The slow unmaking of hate through the simple, unstoppable language of music. Inside the American POW camps, life followed a rhythm few Japanese prisoners could have imagined. Each morning began with roll call, rows of men in khaki remnants, heads shaved, standing in precise silence. American guards, usually young men from small towns in Ohio, Texas, or Iowa, called out numbers in English, and Japanese interpreters repeated them in halting voices. There was order, but not cruelty. The prisoners soon realized that discipline here meant something different, not domination but regulation, a structure that protected both sides from chaos. Meals were simple but regular. Rice was replaced with bread and beans, fish with canned meat. For many, it was the first time in months they had eaten without fear. Medical inspections became routine. The most injured or malnourished were transported to field hospitals. Wounds that once symbolized honor were now treated by the very men they had fought against. That contradiction, mercy from an enemy, unsettled the Japanese psyche more than any defeat on the battlefield. The Americans ran their camps under clear orders from Washington, strict adherence to the Geneva Convention of 1929. This meant adequate food, medical care, correspondence privileges, and protection from public curiosity. To the U.S. military, humane treatment was a moral statement, but also a weapon of ideology. Every Japanese prisoner treated fairly was a potential witness to a new idea, that democracy and compassion could coexist with strength. The contrast with Japanese-run POW camps was stark. In territories under imperial control, from Burma to the Philippines, Allied prisoners had endured starvation, forced labor, and executions. Japanese doctrine viewed surrender as shameful. Thus, captured enemies were often stripped of humanity. When the roles reversed and Japanese soldiers found themselves in captivity, many expected the same fate. Instead, they encountered a system governed by restraint. The shock of that reversal formed the psychological core of their captivity. Daily life slowly expanded beyond survival. Prisoners were encouraged to maintain hygiene, repair clothing, and organize within their own ranks. Some camps introduced literacy and language classes. American chaplains offered English lessons and distributed small books, simple grammar guides, Bibles, and pamphlets on democracy. A few Japanese officers resisted, believing it to be cultural infiltration. Others accepted quietly, curious to understand a nation that had defeated them so thoroughly. Then came the music. At first, it was incidental, played from the American guardhouse radio during maintenance work or training drills. Stations like Armed Forces Radio Service transmitted broadcasts from San Francisco or Honolulu, filling the camp air with the sound of swing and jazz. Benny Goodman, Count Basie, and the unmistakable brass of Glenn Miller's orchestra. The rhythms were foreign, unpredictable, syncopated, almost chaotic. To Japanese ears, trained on martial marches and traditional pentatonic melodies, it sounded like freedom itself, spontaneous, impossible, alive. In time, the camp commanders realized the effect. The music softened tensions. It filled the void of silence that had once hung heavy between guard and prisoner. On Sunday afternoons, when routines eased, a radio would play openly near the mess hall. The guards relaxed. The prisoners listened. Some smiled without meaning to. Others stood still, unable to reconcile the sound of beauty with the face of their enemy. A few American guards, musicians in civilian life, began informal sessions near the gates. They played clarinets, harmonicas, sometimes trumpets. What began as background sound became an event. Prisoners gathered near the fence line, listening quietly, unsure if it was permitted. The guards didn't chase them away. For the first time since capture, some of those men felt curiosity stronger than fear. These moments were small, unnoticed by the world beyond the barbed wire. Yet in their quiet way, they marked the beginning of post-war understanding. The American belief that culture could heal, that exposure, openness, and art could reshape minds, was already taking form before occupation forces even set foot in Tokyo. Behind the music lay an unspoken truth. The Americans were not simply guarding prisoners. They were planting ideas that would later grow into Japan's post-war democracy, its love of Western music, and its enduring fascination with the sound of jazz. But in those months of 1945, none of that was yet visible. There was only the echo of a trumpet, the steady rhythm of swing music, and a confusion of men who had expected vengeance and found rhythm instead. The stage was set for the moment that would astonish them all, when jazz would not just play in the distance, but at the very gates of their captivity. For the Japanese soldier, surrender was not just defeat. It was a loss of identity itself. The Imperial Japanese Army had trained its men under the strict philosophy of Bushido, the way of the warrior. It taught that to die in battle was the highest honor, and that capture was a disgrace to one's family and ancestors. Every soldier carried that code in his veins. From officers to the youngest conscripts, they believed death was the only honorable outcome of failure. Inside the American camps, that belief began to erode, replaced first by numbness, then by confusion. The first days of captivity were marked by silence. Prisoners rarely spoke, even among themselves. They stood at attention during roll call, bowed to the guards, and ate in silence. They avoided eye contact, as if to preserve what little pride remained. Some attempted suicide. Others simply refused food. A few officers tried to maintain military discipline, holding brief assemblies where they reminded their men that they were still soldiers of the emperor. But weeks turned into months, and the discipline cracked under the monotony of daily life. The soldiers were alive, something their own nation had told them was not permissible. American guards, many of whom had fought in the Pacific themselves, often felt an odd mixture of pity and resentment. They could see that these were not monsters, but young men, many barely 20, some even younger. Letters found among their belongings spoke not of ideology, but of mothers, fiancés, and younger brothers left behind. It was a sobering realization. The enemy had been human all along. Gradually, the emotional walls began to crumble. The prisoners started to respond to kindness. A medic offering extra bandages. A guard sharing a cigarette. A kitchen worker sneaking a slice of bread to a man too weak to stand. Each act, small and unrecorded, chipped away at years of propaganda and hatred. But perhaps the most powerful transformation did not come from words or food. It came from sound. To understand why jazz had such an impact, one must understand what it represented. In wartime Japan, Western music had been suppressed. Jazz, in particular, was banned during the height of the war, viewed as decadent and morally corrupt, a product of America's soft culture, unfit for disciplined minds. Radios in Japan had been filled instead with martial anthems, patriotic marches, and solemn songs of duty and sacrifice. The rhythms were rigid, the tone serious. When jazz first echoed through the camp loudspeakers, it violated every expectation the prisoners held about America. The sound was alive, spontaneous, unpredictable. It swung between melancholy and joy with effortless freedom. There was no hierarchy in it, no command. Each instrument seemed to move independently, yet somehow in harmony. To men who had lived under strict military order, it was chaos, but a beautiful one. They did not understand it at first. The irregular rhythm felt strange, almost disorienting, but the emotion was unmistakable. It was music that smiled, and in its strange energy, the prisoners felt something they hadn't felt since before the war: curiosity. To many Americans, jazz was the sound of home. To these Japanese prisoners, it was the sound of another planet. They had expected their captors to be cold, mechanical, and merciless. Instead, the guards hummed along to tunes by Duke Ellington and Count Basie. While working, they moved with a lightness that contrasted sharply with the soldiers' rigid bearing. Even laughter sounded different here. Open, unrestrained, human. That difference was not lost on the prisoners. As weeks passed, they began to associate the strange rhythms of swing with the rhythm of camp life itself. Steady, organized, but free. They could not articulate it, but they could feel it. This music was not about domination. It was about coexistence. Some of the more educated prisoners had studied abroad before the war. A few recognized the names: Armstrong, Goodman, Miller. They tried to explain to their comrades that this was America's art, born not from the military, but from the streets, from the voices of ordinary people. That realization was unsettling. They had been told America was a land of greed and soulless industry. But this music had soul, deep, expressive, and unmistakably human. By late 1945, camp records show that some Japanese prisoners requested to learn English lyrics to the songs they heard. Guards translated words like dream, freedom, and home. For many of these men, the meaning struck a deep chord. The war had taken away not only their freedom, but their sense of choice. Jazz, with its improvisation and playfulness, embodied the very thing their society had suppressed. The more they listened, the more they began to understand. America's power did not come only from its weapons or machines. It came from its culture, its confidence to express, to create, to improvise. Jazz was not just entertainment. It was an act of national identity. Within months, some camps began forming small music groups. The Americans provided makeshift instruments, drums from old barrels, guitars from scrap wood. Japanese prisoners who once marched to the beat of military drums now tried to imitate swing rhythms. Their first attempts were clumsy, but genuine. When camp gates opened for recreation hours, the sound of jazz, rough, uneven, but full of life, floated across the barbed wire. It was not victory music. It was reconciliation in rhythm. The humane treatment of Japanese prisoners was not accidental. It was deliberate, a part of a larger American strategy aimed at reshaping Japan's post-war identity even before the formal occupation began. By mid-1945, Washington understood that the war would not end merely through surrender. Victory had to be psychological as well as military. The Office of War Information, OWI, and the War Department's Civil Affairs Division studied how Japanese ideology functioned, how loyalty, hierarchy, and the emperor's divine authority shaped behavior. They concluded that Japan could not be rebuilt through punishment alone. It would have to be converted, ideologically, culturally, spiritually. POW camps became small laboratories for that experiment. If Japanese soldiers could be shown that Americans were not the barbarians of wartime propaganda, they might carry that message home when released. Thus, the camp systems were managed not merely as detention centers, but as controlled environments for re-education. Prisoners were treated fairly, exposed to democratic values, and, perhaps most powerfully, introduced to the art, literature, and music of the West. In this sense, jazz became more than entertainment. It was soft power, deployed instinctively, without realizing it. The American soldiers playing Glenn Miller records near the gates were advancing the very thing policymakers hoped for, cultural penetration through compassion. The military saw quick results. Prisoners began cooperating during interrogations, not because of coercion, but because they felt respected. They volunteered for labor duties, helped build facilities, and even assisted in translating Allied documents about Japan's future reconstruction. When word spread among new arrivals that Americans treat us well, the effect rippled back through the network of POWs still waiting to be processed. At the highest levels, General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters took note. The humane image of the U.S. Army would become a pillar of the coming occupation, a moral contrast to the empire it had defeated. And in ways no one fully realized at the time, that policy began here, at the level of a radio speaker humming jazz into the evening air. The moral divide between captor and captive in 1945 was not black and white. American soldiers carried their own trauma, memories of kamikaze attacks, massacres, and the unspeakable brutality of the Pacific Islands. To show mercy was not easy. Many guards admitted later that, in their first days at the camps, they could barely look at the prisoners without anger. But discipline and order demanded restraint. The Geneva Convention was not simply a legal text. It was a mirror reflecting what civilization claimed to stand for. The Americans had seen what happened when moral lines disappeared. In Nanjing, on the Bataan Death March, in the slave labor mines of Manchuria. To abandon their own code now would mean surrendering the moral high ground. Thus, restraint became a moral victory in itself. Each humane act was a rejection of the darkness that had consumed so much of the world. To feed, heal, and educate the very men who once tried to kill them was not weakness. It was a statement of principle. Japanese prisoners noticed. They had been taught that compassion had no place in war, that mercy was a luxury of the weak. Yet here was an enemy proving that mercy could coexist with strength. This realization cut deep. It forced reflection. Some began to question the teachings that had defined their youth. Reports from camp psychologists recorded remarkable transformations. Former officers spoke of rethinking the emperor's divinity. Young soldiers, once fiercely loyal, wrote letters expressing admiration for American openness. In some camps, prisoners even formed discussion groups about rebuilding Japan differently. And through it all, the music played on. Jazz, in its joyful defiance, reinforced a new moral rhythm, that freedom was not chaos, and kindness not surrender. War changes the body, But captivity changes the mind. For Japanese POWs, captivity was not just a loss of freedom. It was a collapse of a worldview. The imperial code had offered certainty, an unbroken hierarchy from emperor to private. Now, that hierarchy was gone. In its place stood the unfamiliar logic of democracy and equality, embodied in how the Americans treated them. At first, prisoners responded mechanically, performing chores without emotion. But over time, the regularity of life inside the camps, the routines, the music, the quiet predictability, began to heal the shock of surrender. Psychologists working under the War Department observed that music had a measurable effect on morale. Anxiety levels dropped. Hostility decreased. Prisoners slept better on nights when radios played in the distance. The explanation was both simple and profound. Jazz was improvisational. It allowed the mind to wander, to imagine, to feel. It offered an outlet for emotions the prisoners could not express in words. The sudden rise of a trumpet or the swing of a drumbeat broke through years of emotional repression. For men taught never to reveal weakness, this was liberation. In interviews conducted after repatriation, several former POWs described hearing jazz for the first time as a moment of awakening. One recalled that the music sounded like freedom itself, not as an idea, but as a sound. Another said it was the first time he realized that the enemy was not only strong, but joyful. From a psychological standpoint, the power of that realization cannot be overstated. Defeat had stripped them of pride. Music gave them dignity again, not as soldiers, but as men capable of feeling. It reminded them that life could exist outside duty, outside command, outside fear. In that sense, the Americans achieved something that no weapon ever could. They disarmed the mind. And so, by the winter of 1945, the camps had changed. The barbed wire still stood, but its meaning had softened. The guard and prisoners existed in a fragile, human rhythm, united not by politics, but by sound. The next stage would come suddenly, on a morning when jazz no longer drifted faintly in the distance, but erupted proudly at the very gates, turning an ordinary roll call into an unforgettable moment of history. The Pacific winds were colder now, sweeping across the wire fences of Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, one of the largest Japanese POW camps on American soil. Snow clung to the boots of guards and prisoners alike, a strange sight for men who had once fought under tropical suns. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. But inside the camp, a quieter struggle was still unfolding. The war within each man's heart. The prisoners lived in neat rows of wooden barracks, surrounded by watchtowers and floodlights. Each morning began with the same routine: roll call, inspection, and silence. The Americans had eased restrictions since the surrender. No more barking orders, no more bayonets during meals. Yet the atmosphere remained heavy. The prisoners, numbering several thousand, moved with mechanical precision, bowing automatically to guards who no longer demanded it. Then came the morning that broke the silence. It began like any other. The sun was low, the sky a pale gray over the snowy field. Prisoners lined up for roll call, breath steaming in the cold air. The guards stood by, stamping their feet for warmth. An American corporal, a farm boy from Illinois named Henry Wallace, who also happened to be a jazz enthusiast, was assigned to operate the camp's PA system. Usually, it broadcasted announcements, orders, or sometimes a short armed forces radio program. That morning, Wallace decided to try something different. He had received a new record from home, a 78 revolutions per minute shellac disc of Glenn Miller's Moonlight Serenade. Miller himself had gone missing over the English Channel a year earlier, but his music still echoed across the American conscience, smooth, melancholic, and deeply human. Wallace placed the record on the turntable, adjusted the volume, and watched the needle fall. A soft crackle filled the air. Then, gently, the opening notes drifted from the loudspeakers. The sound spread across the camp. Slow, elegant, dreamlike. The prisoners froze. Heads turned toward the towers. Some flinched, expecting an announcement or warning. None came. Only the melody, sliding from saxophone to trumpet, carried by the wind over the snow. For many of the Japanese soldiers, it was the first time they had ever heard that kind of music clearly. It wasn't martial or triumphant. It was wistful, sad yet hopeful, a sound that seemed to belong to a world without uniforms or orders. At first, no one moved. Guards watched in silence as the prisoners stood motionless, listening. Then, something remarkable happened. One of the older prisoners, a former Navy petty officer named Saito, lifted his eyes and began to weep. Not loudly, not dramatically, but silently. His shoulders shook. The man beside him, uncertain what to do, placed a hand on his arm. In the guard tower, Wallace noticed and hesitated, his hand hovering over the turntable. But the camp commander, Captain Robert Nash, who had come to see what the commotion was, simply nodded. "Let it play," he said. And so it played. The entire camp, guards and prisoners alike, stood still as the music flowed to the cold morning air. The snow softened the sound, making it even more tender. It was as though the war itself had exhaled. In later reports, American officers wrote that something unexplainable passed through the camp that day. For the first time, the Japanese prisoners did not seem like captives. They were simply men, weary, wounded, and human. After the song ended, the prisoners remained where they stood. Then, quietly, a few began to bow, not as soldiers, but as men expressing gratitude. The guards, unsure how to respond, nodded in return. No words were exchanged. None were needed. That morning marked a shift that would ripple far beyond the fences. The camp's atmosphere changed. The prisoners began to speak more freely. They smiled. Some asked about the music, who composed it, what it meant. American guards explained as best they could, describing Glenn Miller, swing, and the joy of dancing to a rhythm that celebrated life. Within weeks, requests came from the prisoners. Play that song again. Soon, the camp's recreation hall became a place where both sides could gather. Guards teaching prisoners how to clap to the beat, prisoners trying to mimic the rhythms on handmade drums. No speeches, no lectures, just sound and silence, alternating, balancing. When a visiting Army chaplain asked Captain Nash why he allowed it, the officer simply said, "Because they need to hear what peace sounds like." And that, more than any policy or order, captured the true essence of America's victory, not in atomic power, not in military supremacy, but in the ability to turn music into mercy. For the prisoners, the memory of that day would never fade. Many would later describe it to their families back home, some even humming the melody to their children decades later. They did not know the words, but they remembered the feeling that freedom could have a sound, and that sound was jazz. The barbed wire still stood, but its meaning had changed. The guards noticed it first. The way the prisoners now greeted them with small nods instead of rigid bows, the faint hum of music drifting from the barracks during work details. The prisoners had begun to recreate the melody they'd heard, tapping it out on tabletops, whistling as they swept snow, even singing softly to one another. American officers, curious, observed quietly. They had not planned this transformation, but they understood its value. Where language had failed, melody had succeeded. Jazz had crossed the gulf of ideology without a translator. It carried no rank, no nation, no command, only emotion, the guards' perspective. For the American guards, the change was just as profound. Many of them had fought in the Pacific, some on Saipan, others at Leyte or Okinawa. They had seen the worst of the war, the fanatic charges, the suicides, the cruelty. They had been taught to see Japanese soldiers as unfeeling machines of the emperor. Yet in these camps, they encountered frail, polite men who bowed even when handed food. Private letters from guards later revealed a surprising sentiment. One soldier wrote home, "They're not what we thought. They're quiet, respectful. They listen when we talk. Sometimes when the music plays, they just stop. It's like they're remembering something." Another wrote that the music softened his own anger for men haunted by the brutality of the Pacific. This was a different kind of healing. It gave purpose to the duty of guarding former enemies. In an age when victory could easily have become vengeance, the guards found a form of peace they hadn't known they needed. Inside the barracks, inside the Japanese barracks, the atmosphere changed too. The prisoners began organizing small study groups, led by educated men who spoke some English. They asked the Americans for dictionaries, magazines, even newspapers. They wanted to understand a strange civilization that could produce both atomic bombs and music as gentle as moonlight serenade. At night, the sound of whistling and soft humming echoed through the camp. Some prisoners, using scraps of wood and wire, built makeshift instruments. A guard, amused, lent them a broken guitar. Within days, they were trying to play in the mood, imperfectly but with visible joy. The music had become more than entertainment. It was an emotional bridge, a private act of reconciliation between captor and captive, the outside world. By early 1946, news of humane conditions in American POW camps began reaching Japan through the Red Cross and returning prisoners. Families were stunned. The imperial government had told them their sons would be tortured or killed if captured. Instead, they received letters describing clean barracks, food, and, most astonishingly, music. One former POW, later interviewed by the Japanese press, recalled the moment vividly. "I thought I had died. It was impossible that the Americans would play music for us. But when I heard that sound, I realized the war was truly over. We were no longer soldiers. We were human again." This testimony resonated deeply in a country still reeling from the atomic bombings and surrender. For ordinary Japanese citizens, it shattered years of propaganda and helped plant the earliest seeds of trust toward the American occupiers. The symbolism of jazz. Jazz had come to embody something much larger than itself. To the Americans, it was a soundtrack of liberty, a genre born from diversity, improvisation, and rebellion. It spoke of a nation that allowed voices to clash and blend freely, creating harmony through difference. To the Japanese prisoners, it represented something they had never known: individuality without chaos, freedom without anarchy. Musicologists studying post-war Japan would later write that this encounter, the exposure of Japanese POWs to jazz, became one of the earliest cultural exchanges between the two nations after the war. Many of those former soldiers returned home with radios and records gifted by American personnel. Within a decade, jazz clubs would begin appearing in Tokyo, Osaka, and Yokohama, symbols of a cultural rebirth that grew directly from those first notes behind barbed wire. Personal transformations. Among those prisoners at Camp McCoy was one man who would later become a university teacher in post-war Japan. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka, a former naval officer captured at Okinawa. Years later, in his memoirs, he recalled, "I could not understand why they played that music. It was beautiful. It made me ashamed, not because I lost a war, but because I believed my enemy could not be human. That day, I learned that civilization is not about who wins, but who forgives." Tanaka would later teach his students about that experience, describing jazz not as American propaganda, but as the sound of democracy. He became part of Japan's new intellectual generation, men who believed that rebuilding their nation required embracing openness, creativity, and compassion. The broader turning point. The psychological effect of this cultural moment extended far beyond the camp. When Japan's surrender was announced in August 1945, most Americans celebrated with relief. But victory carried an uncomfortable question. How would a nation so brutalized by total war be reintegrated into the world community? The answer began quietly, in places like Camp McCoy, where compassion met confusion and produced understanding. By early 1946, the U.S. military recognized the value of this soft approach. Similar programs of music, education, and cultural exchange were implemented in other POW camps and later expanded to occupy Japan. What began as a spontaneous act, one corporal playing a record, evolved into a guiding principle of post-war reconstruction, that hearts could be changed not by force, but by humanity. In that sense, the true turning point of the Pacific War did not happen at Hiroshima or aboard the USS Missouri. It happened here, in a snow-covered camp, where jazz replaced the sound of gunfire, and forgiveness began to find its voice. The music had done what weapons never could. It ended the war inside the minds of the defeated. When winter finally lifted from Camp McCoy in early 1946, the prisoners began to change in visible ways. Their uniforms, once stiff with mud and despair, were patched and cleaned. The guards reported fewer disciplinary issues. Meals were shared with quiet gratitude instead of shame. And every Sunday morning, just after roll call, Someone would bring out a record player and set a single disc spinning beneath the stylus. It was never ordered, never official, but the camp knew what it meant. The jazz had become a ritual. For the Japanese prisoners, it symbolized the rhythm of a world they were still learning to understand. For the American guards, it was a reminder that victory did not demand cruelty. Re-education by culture. By mid-1946, the United States War Department began developing formal programs for the re-education of Axis prisoners. In the Pacific camps, these programs were cautious, respectful of Japanese pride, yet aimed at encouraging reflection. Lessons on democracy, civic duty, and even basic English were introduced. Books and newspapers arrived through the Red Cross. But among all these tools, nothing proved as universally disarming as music. Records by Glenn Miller, Benny Goodman, and Duke Ellington circulated through barracks, provided by camp staff who noticed their calming influence. Even prisoners who spoke little English could feel the structure, improvisation, and energy, the sense of controlled freedom within the chaos of rhythm. Psychologists attached to the War Department later noted that camps where such cultural exchanges occurred reported notably higher morale and lower resistance to authority. In other words, jazz was not just entertainment. It was psychological reconstruction, repatriation, and return. By late 1946, the process of repatriating Japanese prisoners began in earnest. Ships departing from Seattle and San Francisco carried thousands of men home. Many of them changed in ways they struggled to explain. On board, they hummed fragments of songs, some even carrying small record players they had purchased from surplus stores. The U.S. military allowed such items to be kept. Officials recognized the symbolic importance, a peaceful reminder of what the prisoners had experienced in captivity. When these men stepped off the ships in Yokohama, they brought with them not just memories, but melodies. Families gathered at the ports to welcome sons they thought long dead. The men bowed, frail but smiling, and in the weeks that followed, they began to tell stories, not of cruelty but of kindness. Stories of Americans who shared cigarettes, who lent them books, who played music that made them forget they were enemies. These accounts traveled faster than any propaganda leaflet. In coffee shops and ration lines, people whispered, "The Americans played music for our soldiers." It was a small phrase, but it carried enormous weight. In a society still grappling with the humiliation of defeat, it challenged old assumptions about the West. The enemy, it seemed, could be merciful, the seeds of post-war trust. The U.S. occupation of Japan under General Douglas MacArthur officially began in late 1945, but its success depended on something that could not be commanded: trust. And trust, in its earliest form, was born not in Tokyo's government buildings, but in the quiet exchanges between guards and prisoners across the Pacific. Reports from former POWs directly influenced how ordinary Japanese viewed the American occupation. Many who had experienced humane treatment abroad became community leaders, translators, and educators in the Reconstruction period. Their testimony gave credibility to the message of reform. That democracy did not mean chaos, that freedom could coexist with order. Historians today point to these personal transformations as the human groundwork of post-war diplomacy. Before treaties and economic aid, there were gestures, small, almost invisible moments of decency that softened the path toward reconciliation. Jazz in a broken nation. As Japan began to rebuild its cities from the ashes of firebombing, American cultural influence seeped into every corner of life. Radios crackled again in Tokyo apartments, carrying swing and jazz through shattered neighborhoods. GI clubs and occupation broadcasts filled the air with sounds that only a few years earlier would have been unthinkable. Young Japanese civilians, students, musicians, even black market traders, became fascinated by the new rhythm. For them, jazz represented not just American culture but modernity itself. The freedom to improvise, to create without strict hierarchy. Some historians trace the post-war Japanese jazz movement directly to returning POWs who had heard it first behind barbed wire. One such veteran, musician Ryoichi Hattori, would later recall in a 1950 interview, "When I first heard that trumpet through the loudspeaker, I didn't understand it. But later, when I came home and picked up my saxophone, I realized that sound was hope." By 1950, jazz cafes were opening in Osaka and Tokyo, frequented by students, intellectuals, and American servicemen alike. In these smoky rooms, the memory of war gave way to dialogue, sometimes in broken English, sometimes in pure music, a quiet American strategy. Although unplanned at first, the U.S. government soon recognized the soft power of cultural diplomacy. Military reports described the unexpected psychological benefits of exposing prisoners and civilians to American music and media. This insight would later shape one of the most successful nation-rebuilding efforts in history, the transformation of wartime Japan into a peaceful ally. Where propaganda had failed, culture had succeeded. The story that began with a jazz record at a prison gate had, by 1947, become part of a global shift, from domination to dialogue, from hatred to human connection. And yet, for those who had lived through it, the memory remained deeply personal. The sound of a trumpet on a winter morning became a symbol of everything the war had taken, and what humanity had managed to return. In the years after 1947, the physical remnants of the prisoner of war camps faded. The barracks were dismantled, the barbed wire rolled up, and the grounds converted to farmland or training sites for the peacetime army. But for those who had lived inside them, both guards and prisoners, the sound of that first jazz tune never disappeared. It lingered as a private echo of something larger than surrender, the rediscovery of humanity, the veterans' memories. By the 1950s, letters and memoirs from former American guards began to circulate through veterans' organizations. Many wrote about how the experience had changed their perception of the enemy. One sergeant from Wisconsin recalled, "They bowed to us even when we gave them food. When we played that record, some of them cried. That's when I realized the war had ended. But kindness was still a weapon, maybe the strongest one. For men who had returned from the Pacific haunted by brutality, these memories provided a form of release. They had seen death in places like Iwo Jima and Peleliu. They had learned to expect hate. But in the camps, they had learned that compassion could coexist with discipline. That victory was not defined by destruction, but by restraint. Many guards continued to write to former prisoners after the war, exchanging photographs, gifts, and even jazz records through Red Cross mail routes. These friendships, once unthinkable, symbolize a quiet healing that official peace treaties could never legislate. Japan's cultural awakening. Meanwhile in Japan, the seeds planted by returning prisoners began to grow in unexpected ways. Universities, once dominated by militarist thought, reopened with new departments dedicated to Western literature, international relations, and philosophy. Among the most popular courses were those on American culture, particularly music. In post-war Tokyo, jazz cafes like Chigusa and Jinpari became meeting places for a generation seeking identity in a world without empire. Young men who had once marched to imperial drums now listened to Count Basie and Louis Armstrong, their minds awakened by rhythm and improvisation. By the early 1950s, Japan had developed one of the most vibrant jazz scenes outside the United States. It was more than music. It was a declaration that Japan could modernize without losing its soul. The freedom of jazz mirrored the country's political rebirth, structured yet creative, disciplined yet democratic. Former POWs often visited these clubs. Some even became performers or patrons. They did not speak often of their wartime past, but their presence said enough. The sound that had once stunned them in captivity now played in the open streets of their rebuilt homeland. A new relationship. Diplomatic relations between Japan and the United States formally normalized with the Treaty of San Francisco in 1951. But long before signatures were inked, the emotional groundwork had already been laid by thousands of small human interactions in classrooms, factories, and yes, even prison camps. The U.S. occupation strategy shifted from control to partnership, guided by a simple truth. Nations could be remade not only through governance but through empathy. American advisors encouraged Japanese filmmakers, artists, and musicians, recognizing that a democratic society needed cultural expression as much as economic aid. Within this broader effort, jazz played a subtle but powerful role. It represented everything authoritarianism could not: spontaneity, equality, collaboration. When Japanese audiences embraced it, they were embracing the rhythm of a new world order. Echoes across generations. Decades later, historians looking back on post-war reconciliation often cite major political milestones: the Marshall Plan, the signing of treaties, the economic miracle. Yet beneath those headlines lay 1,000 smaller stories that shaped the moral landscape of the 20th century. The moment an American soldier placed a record on a turntable in a POW camp may seem trivial in scale, but history is often changed not by grand declarations, but by small acts that reveal who we are. The jazz that once floated over the snow in Wisconsin became part of Japan's cultural DNA, influencing not only its music, but its worldview, one open to exchange, innovation, and peace. In the 1970s, documentaries about the Pacific War began revisiting these forgotten camps. Surviving prisoners and guards appeared together on camera, shaking hands, even laughing. When one journalist asked a former Japanese soldier what he remembered most, he didn't mention hunger or cold. He simply said, "I remember the sound. It was the first sound of freedom." That phrase became the title of a 1974 NHK documentary, The First Sound of Freedom, which aired to millions across Japan. For younger viewers, it was the first time they had heard that even in captivity, dignity had survived. Legacy. By the end of the 20th century, jazz had become one of Japan's proudest cultural exports. Japanese musicians performed at Carnegie Hall. American jazz legends toured Tokyo to packed audiences. Few in those crowds knew that the story of Japan's love affair with jazz had begun behind barbed wire, born from an act of mercy between enemies. For historians, the lesson endures. Military victory may end a war, but peace begins only when understanding replaces fear. The Americans who played that record at Camp McCoy may not have known it, but they were tuning the world to a new frequency, one of coexistence, not conquest. And for the men who once stood barefoot in the snow, heads bowed before a loudspeaker, that music remained a lifelong reminder the day war truly ended. Not with silence, but with song. Reflection/closure. History often remembers wars by their noise, the roar of engines, the thunder of artillery, the shouts of men. But sometimes, the most enduring sound is what follows when the guns fall silent. In the ruins of 1945, two nations once locked in total destruction began to rediscover their humanity through something as fragile as a melody. Jazz, born in the improvisation of hardship, in the struggle and hope of people seeking freedom, became a bridge between conqueror and conquered. It taught that civilization is not measured by the weapons we wield, but by the grace we show when victory is ours. For the Americans who played it, the music was a reminder that democracy without compassion becomes hollow. For the Japanese who heard it, it was proof that defeat did not mean humiliation, that even in surrender, dignity could survive. From the frozen barracks of Camp McCoy to the neon-lit jazz clubs of Tokyo, the same rhythm endured. It was a rhythm of renewal, the heartbeat of a world learning, painfully, how to live together again. Today, when historians trace the rebirth of post-war Japan or the evolution of U.S. Japanese friendship, they often cite treaties, policies, and economic miracles. Yet, beneath all of that lies one simple truth. Peace is not built by documents, but by moments of humanity. The quiet choices of individuals who refuse to see their enemies as less than human. In the end, the war that began in hatred found its closure not in a courtroom or a conference hall, but in a forgotten camp, when a trumpet's note crossed a divide between nations. The prisoners who once stood in stunned silence before the camp gates would carry that sound home, a note of mercy that would echo for generations. And in that echo lies the final lesson of war. Weapons can win battles. Empathy wins the peace.